Good evening. Wherever you may be tonight, let this hour carry you across distant waters and forgotten coasts. Let your thoughts drift with the tide, far from the noise of the day, into a slower world, where sails creak in the breeze and stars hang low above quiet waves. This is a story about the sea, and about the man they once called Blackbeard. He was not born a legend. Like many who vanished into the salt and silence of the ocean, he began as a nameless sailor. The world behind him was cold and narrow, full of rules and rigid faces. The world ahead, the open sea, was wide, lawless, and full of promise. He stepped into it without hesitation, leaving behind the weight of names, lands, and oaths. What he found was a life built on instinct, wind, and survival. The men who turned to piracy in those days were not always villains. They were often former soldiers, sailors, and dreamers who had no place left in the empires that had used them and cast them aside. The sea became their refuge, and the ship their home. Among these men, Blackbeard found his purpose, not as a tyrant, but as a presence. Calm, calculating, and utterly fearless. His ship, known as Queen Anne's Revenge, moved through the Caribbean like a ghost, steady, silent, and impossible to ignore. The black sails billowed against blood-orange sunsets. Smoke curled from slow-burning fuses woven into his thick, tangled beard, creating a figure more myth than man. Yet those who served under him spoke not of cruelty, but of discipline, silence, and strange calm. There were rules aboard his ship, simple but unwavering, and to break them was to threaten the balance he maintained. He understood that fear was a tool. A single appearance on the horizon, no cannon fired, no voice raised, could empty a merchant vessel without bloodshed. His reputation did the work of armies. But beneath that mask of terror was something more deliberate. Blackbeard was not chasing chaos, he was avoiding it. He rarely stayed in one place for long. Harbors were temporary, alliances even more so. The sea gave everything and took everything, and he moved with it, never trying to tame it, only to survive within its ever-changing rhythm. He was both part of the ocean and apart from it, guided by its moods, never trying to control them. At night, his ship would drift in hidden coves, the creak of wood blending with distant birdsong and the slow lapping of the tide. The crew would speak softly over food and rum, some sharpening blades, others singing songs in languages long lost to the world. And Blackbeard would often sit apart, staring out into the black water, his thoughts unreadable, like the depths themselves. He was not loud, he did not shout to be heard. When he spoke, men listened, not out of fear, but because silence was his nature. He did not waste words. His power lay not in his strength, but in the space he held. He was a man who had learned long ago that the loudest presence in a room was often the one that said nothing. There was no quest for power, no desire for crowns or territory. His world was made of wind, sail, and salt. Each day was a choice to remain unbound. His name, whispered across the waters, was less a title than a shadow, a reminder that freedom comes at a price and that some men choose to pay it in full. The ship he commanded was called Queen Anne's Revenge. It had once belonged to another fleet, refitted, armed with dozens of cannons, and adapted for endurance rather than speed. It was not graceful, but it could carry men, supplies, and enough firepower to avoid most confrontations. On calm waters, it moved slowly, the dark sails dragging low against the sky. When spotted from a distance, its silhouette seemed heavier than other ships, thicker masts, broad stern, and a flag that needed no translation. Blackbeard's method was rarely violent by design. He preferred to avoid a fight, and most of the time he did. Cargo was more valuable when it arrived intact. A frightened crew surrendered quicker. Merchants at sea, faced with a warship flying no colors and trailing a veil of smoke, often gave up their goods before the first warning shot. That was the outcome he wanted. Fast, quiet, and without injury. His crew followed a routine. They rose early, adjusted sails, checked for leaks, and shared food without ceremony. Every man aboard had a task. There were no formal ranks, only experience. If someone failed to do their part, they answered to the group. On that ship, respect mattered more than hierarchy. There were moments of rest, days when the wind was still, when the sea offered nothing but slow movement and open sky. During those times, repairs were made. Ropes were checked. Wet powder was dried in the sun. Sometimes men fished, sometimes they cleaned weapons. The quiet was not idleness, it was maintenance of the ship, of the crew, of the rhythm that kept everything from falling apart. Blackbeard rarely stayed below deck. He observed everything, the weather, the crew, the lines in the water. He spoke little, but when he did, it was clear, to the point. He did not command with anger, he simply expected competence. Those who lacked it didn't last long. The ocean did not allow many second chances. There were no grand speeches, no rituals. The crew drank when there was time, sang when the mood allowed, and kept to their own when the nights stretched long. Most were not loyal to a cause. They stayed because the system worked. They ate, they earned, and they were safer in a group than alone. The captain made that possible. Port visits were brief. Supplies were gathered quickly: dried meat, hard bread, barrels of water, powder, tools. Most business was done through intermediaries. Blackbeard preferred not to draw attention unless it served a purpose. If the locals feared him, they stayed quiet. If they wanted trade, they kept it simple. No names, no questions. He knew the coastlines well, the safe inlets, the narrow channels where a larger ship couldn't follow. He didn't need charts. Years at sea had etched the routes into his memory. If a Navy vessel gave chase, he didn't outfight it. He disappeared behind reefs, into fog, beneath low cloud cover. He waited, moved, changed course. He didn't need to win battles, he needed to avoid them. At night, the ship settled. The lanterns burned low. Most of the crew slept where they could. On deck, near the cannon mounts, between barrels in the hold. A few men stood watch, listening for any change in the wind. And the captain remained near the stern, awake longer than most, saying nothing, always scanning the water. There were no trophies aboard, no decorations, nothing to mark success beyond supplies and survival. It was not a romantic life, it was quiet, hard, and repetitive. But for Blackbeard, it was the only kind that made sense. In the waters he frequented, few ships matched the Queen Anne's Revenge in presence. Though not the fastest on open sea, it was built for pressure, a wide hull that could carry more than cargo, and masts tall enough to support sail arrangements for slow maneuvering near coastlines. Blackbeard knew the limits of his vessel and never asked more than it could give. He kept away from the trade routes most captains favored. Instead, he sailed along the edge of charts, close to shoals and mangroves, where the air grew thick and the sound of insects replaced the cry of gulls. There, the risk of grounding was higher, but the chance of ambush was low. The Queen Anne's Revenge could lie still for days in these quiet waters, Sails furled, crew silent, as if the ship had become part of the landscape itself. Sometimes they waited for a target, other times they waited for the sea to decide. Patience came naturally aboard that ship. The crew had learned that movement for its own sake meant exposure, and in the waters where Blackbeard operated, exposure invited attention, not just from prey, but from those who hunted pirates in turn. Blackbeard rarely explained his choices. A change in course, a sudden shift in position, or a full retreat were given without discussion. His men didn't question him. He wasn't feared for temper or threat, but because he so rarely spoke, and when he did, it was always necessary. The absence of excess gave his words their weight. The crew was mixed, drawn from ports all across the colonies and islands. Some had followed him from earlier voyages, others were taken in after other captains fell or vanished. There were no oaths, no formal bonds beyond the mutual need to stay afloat. Trust, when it existed, was based on routine, on knowing how another man tied a rope or loaded a musket. Everything else was private. There were no grand feasts or celebrations. After a successful seizure, the goods were sorted quietly. Food and powder were restocked. Fabric was traded or stowed. Coins, when found, were split according to unwritten terms. No ledger kept score. The value of cooperation was understood, not negotiated. At night, the deck was usually dark. Lanterns were dimmed and voices kept low. Most of the crew rested under the stars, wrapped in cloth or curled near the rails. The wind dropped after midnight, and the ship rocked slowly in the shallow tide. In those hours, time lost its sharpness. The sea, the sky, the men aboard, all drifted together. Blackbeard stayed awake longer than most. He walked the deck with slow steps, the sound of his boots muffled by the wood, softened with salt and age. He would pause near the wheel, not to steer, but to observe. Sometimes he looked toward the horizon. Other times, he simply sat in the shadows of the rigging, unmoving. There was no ritual to it, no sign of burden or command. He did not appear restless, only present, as if the night had a rhythm of its own, and he was simply part of it. The crew learned to leave him alone in those moments. They knew when not to speak. They knew when silence mattered more than any question. The sea had always held space for those who lived outside its rules. There were islands where no flag was flown, no laws enforced. There, ships like Blackbeard's could rest, far from the reach of the world that claimed order and power. These places were not marked on most maps, but they were known by those who needed them. The Queen Anne's Revenge would sometimes anchor in such coves, its hull blending into the shadow of cliffs or palms. The crew would go ashore in small groups to stretch their legs, refill water, barter for tools, or simply disappear for a while. There was no roll call when they returned. If a man did not come back, the ship sailed without him. Trade happened quietly, often without words. Goods passed from hand to hand. A barrel of rum for rope, a sack of dried citrus for powder. There were no fixed prices, only the knowledge of what something was worth to a ship days from its next port. Blackbeard rarely stepped onto land during these stops. He remained aboard or near the shallows, watching from the shade. His presence was often enough to discourage questions. Locals didn't approach him unless invited, and even then they kept their distance. When needed, messages were passed to trusted go-betweens, men who spoke the language of the shoreline, who could enter and leave without notice. These men arranged repairs, moved coin, listened for news. If a Navy vessel had left port, Blackbeard knew before its sails were raised. He had no need for alliances. They shifted too easily. What he required was time, enough to move, to vanish, to choose the next step without pressure. He never waited for permission. Back at sea, the mood aboard the ship was constant. It did not shift with success or failure. The days repeated themselves in slow, careful patterns. Meals were shared in silence, tools passed hand to hand, the same knots tied and retied. Even the air seemed slower in those parts of the ocean. Storms came without warning. Heavy rain, sharp winds, the sudden drop of sky into grey water. When they did, Blackbeard was calm. Orders were few but clear. Sails adjusted, deck cleared, anything loose secured. He did not rush. Panic served no one. After the rain passed, the ship would drift in stillness. Water collected in buckets, clothes hung to dry. Men worked with sleeves rolled and feet bare, moving through the wet wood like they had done it 100 times before. Blackbeard's movements during these days were minimal. He checked lines. He watched the horizon. He stood near the bow for long stretches, not searching, simply being. The crew no longer looked to him for approval or instruction unless something broke that rhythm. His presence was part of the ship now, not its master, but its balance. On clear nights, stars filled the sky so thickly that it became difficult to see where the sky ended and the sea began. The mast creaked gently with each shift of water, and a low wind passed through the rigging like breath. The men spoke in low voices if they spoke at all. Sometimes songs were hummed, old and without words, and Blackbeard, always nearby, rarely addressed, remained in the space between action and stillness. He did not sing. He did not join the meals. But his footsteps on the deck were familiar now, like the sound of the tide beneath the hull. There was nothing grand in these nights, only the repetition of survival, the comfort of routine, and the slow movement of time measured not by clocks, but by light and wind. Over time, the name Blackbeard began to drift ahead of the man himself. Stories arrived in ports before his ship ever came into view. Some spoke of entire fleets falling to a single command. Others described rituals on deck, curses spoken in strange tongues, or glowing lights seen in the dark just before a merchant ship disappeared. Most of it was false. But Blackbeard never corrected the stories. He understood that reputation, once set loose, needed no guidance. It traveled faster than sail and lasted longer than steel. Captains began changing course at the first hint of his presence. Merchants added guards to their ships or delayed departures entirely. Even among other pirates, his name was spoken with caution. Not out of fear of betrayal, but because he remained apart, a figure outside the loose brotherhoods and shifting loyalties that bound most men to one another. He never sought loyalty beyond necessity. The crew followed him because the ship remained afloat, because the holds were never empty for long, and because the days passed without chaos. That was enough. He demanded no oaths. Those who wished to leave did so. Those who stayed knew the rhythm and the risk. Among the crew, there was a growing awareness that the ship was more than a vessel. It was a line drawn across the world, between those who sailed freely and those who lived by rules written far from the sea. The Queen Anne's Revenge became a place outside of time, carrying men not toward a destination, but away from everything they had once known. There was no plan for the future, no dream of harbor or homestead. The life they lived existed in the present, measured in knots, in wind shifts, in the weight of the anchor as it broke water. For Blackbeard, this absence of destination seemed not only acceptable, but necessary. He was not looking for a place to rest. He was avoiding one. When the ship returned to familiar waters, it was not for conquest. Sometimes it was to resupply. Sometimes to collect rumor. More often, it was simply to disappear again into the same routes, unchanged, unnoticed. The places they visited blurred together. The sea was the only constant. The men who shared that space with him learned to read silence the way others read charts. A glance toward the sky, a hand resting on the rail, the pause before an order, all became signals. The work was steady, the pay fair, and the danger understood. There were few losses. When men died, in storms, in miscalculated raids from sickness, there were no speeches. The body was taken to the side, the weight considered, and it was released into the sea. No ceremony, no farewell, only the sound of water and the brief silence that followed. Blackbeard did not change in these moments. He did not retreat, nor did he console. His eyes followed the body into the dark, and then he turned away. Not coldly, but as if returning to something that had merely paused. It was not indifference. It was understanding. The ocean gave and took in equal measure. He had accepted this long ago. At night, when the stars burned clearly and the wind fell quiet, he sometimes walked the deck barefoot, his steps barely audible on the salt-softened wood. He would stop near the bow, lean against the rope, and stare into the distance. There was no urgency in his posture, only stillness. The men who noticed did not interrupt. They let him drift as they did through the hours that stretched between one tide and the next. No one asked what he was thinking. They already knew he would not answer. There came a time when the sea around him began to grow smaller, not in distance, but in reach. Patrols were more frequent. Harbors once friendly turned uncertain. The rules of the land, which had long remained distant echoes, began to press closer to the waterline. Governments sought to reclaim the seas they had ignored for too long. They issued proclamations, offered pardons, promised amnesty to those who would give up their trade. Some pirates accepted. They turned in their weapons, swore new allegiances, and found safe passage to new lives. Others disappeared, not trusting the offers, not believing in forgiveness spoken through legal tongues. Blackbeard did not speak of it. He neither condemned nor encouraged. He listened, then charted a new course, not away from the threat, but around it. He kept to smaller channels, avoided familiar harbors, and relied more heavily on the men who knew the shoreline best. The Queen Anne's Revenge changed with the times. The hull carried fewer guns. The sails were patched more often than replaced. Supplies grew leaner. The crew, once large, became smaller by choice or by chance. Yet the ship sailed on, still cutting through the tide with steady purpose, still avoiding the paths most others took. They no longer sought riches. Most of what they carried now was trade, cloth, spices, tools. No one called it piracy aloud, but few believed it was anything else. The sea still gave, though not as often. And when it did, Blackbeard took only what he needed, leaving behind more than he once would have. Those who remained aboard did so because they understood what the world was becoming. They saw the horizon closing, the winds shifting toward order. But they also knew that the time they had was still theirs, that as long as the sails held and the ship stayed free, the story wasn't over. There were still quiet nights, still the hush of waves against the hull, still the sound of rope moving through a sailor's fingers. The rituals had not changed, even as the reasons had. Blackbeard became quieter with time, not from age, but from clarity. The fewer words he spoke, the more the ship listened. There was nothing left to prove. His voice had already shaped more than commands. It had built a way of moving, a way of waiting, a way of not being caught. He no longer walked the deck with the same weight. His steps were slower, but still deliberate. When he stopped near the helm or leaned against the rail, it was not to command. It was to remain part of the rhythm. He did not speak of endings. He did not plan for land. The crew followed the same patterns. Repairs were made without instruction. Meals were cooked without noise. When a man left, there was no farewell, only a space left empty. No one asked when the journey would end. The ship became a memory in motion. It floated through the channels like a story half told. Visible one moment, vanished the next. Villages watched from shorelines, unsure if what they had seen was real or some echo of what had once passed through these waters. And still he remained aboard. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had not yet finished going. There were no more chases, no more flags, only the slow, steady movement of a man who understood the shape of silence. On the clearest nights, when the moon sat low and the sea held still like glass, the ship would drift with no purpose but presence. And on the deck, among shadows and old rope, he stood where he always had, a shape more familiar than feared, as much a part of the vessel as the wood beneath his feet. There was no headline to mark his final voyage, no monument raised, no witnesses who told the whole of it. What came of Blackbeard in the end was never written with certainty. Some say he vanished in battle, others that he walked away and was never followed. But the sea does not care for endings, only for absence. The Queen Anne's revenge was found, or not. Burned, sunk, taken. It depends on which port the story comes from. But no matter the version, the ship stopped moving. The figure that once stood at the bow became memory, not because someone chose to forget, but because the ocean has no use for permanence. The crew dispersed, some took other ships, some returned to shore, their names unknown, their stories folded into the quiet lives of ordinary men. A few remained afloat, carrying with them habits learned from years under his shadow. Soft speech, quiet work, the understanding that control was not force, but timing. Blackbeard himself was last seen, or imagined, near the edge of familiar waters. The wind was low, the tide slow, no flag was raised, no orders were given. He stood alone on a vessel that had carried him through storms and stillness alike, and when the world lost sight of him, it did so without struggle. In the years that followed, stories bloomed. Some turned him into a monster, others a martyr. Plays were written, paintings made. His image twisted to fit the fears and fascinations of those who needed such figures. But the man who had once walked barefoot on damp wood, who had shared salted bread with silent men beneath cracked sails, was no longer part of that picture. His legacy was not in treasure. He left no kingdom behind. What he offered was simpler, quieter, the memory of freedom not granted, but taken. A life unshaped by law, a rhythm that answered only to wind and instinct. There are still nights when sailors speak of him, not in awe, but in quiet respect. They speak of how he held a ship together without shouting, how he read the sea as if it spoke to him alone, how he disappeared without needing to explain why. And there are places on the water where the air shifts strangely, where the sky feels heavier, where the sound of a lone rope brushing against wood breaks the silence like a memory. In those places, some say he still drifts, not in body, but in the shape of the current, the lean of a mast, the pause before the wind changes. The sea has never kept records. It forgets names, swallows dates, and turns battles into currents. But it remembers movement. It remembers rhythm. Blackbeard became part of that rhythm, not because of what he conquered, but because of how he moved, slowly, deliberately, without asking to be seen. The night he vanished left no storm behind, only stillness, the kind of stillness that comes when something once loud has gone quiet. And so, this story closes where most sea stories do, not with an ending, but with a fading line on the water, a shape that moves out of sight, a name whispered not for fear, but for the hush it leaves behind. If you listen closely, in the quiet part of the night, beneath the hum of your own breath and the softness of your thoughts, you might still hear it. The sound of a ship drifting far beyond the edge of maps, and the memory of a man who asked for nothing and left with everything the sea could give. Not all ships were rivals. The sea was wide enough in those years for meetings that did not end in gunfire. At certain times, in certain waters, pirate crews crossed paths in silence, two vessels anchored far apart, their captains watching each other from the deck, saying nothing, waiting to see who would blink first. Sometimes no one did. A sail was lowered, a dinghy crossed the space between hulls. There would be an exchange of goods, or news, or simply the understanding that the ocean was not a place for enemies today. Blackbeard had no alliance, but neither did he isolate himself completely. He acknowledged the codes followed by others when it suited him. He respected the quiet, unspoken lines drawn between captains who understood that survival meant more than profit. There were men he had seen before, ships whose flags he recognized, crews whose faces changed, but whose movements remained familiar. Among these, there were names spoken in half tones, not warnings, not yet, but reminders of past disagreements, of raids gone wrong, of lines crossed without intention. He remembered the names, but never chased them. He had no appetite for revenge, only for balance. A ship left alone today might carry warning tomorrow. A ship betrayed would speak in every port. The sea remembered patterns, and he had no interest in leaving the wrong kind behind. He rarely went aboard another vessel. When he did, it was brief. He walked the deck with the same stillness he kept on his own, eyes low, boots slow on unfamiliar wood. He spoke little, watched much. Sometimes he left without taking anything. Sometimes he left with something no one had noticed was missing. His reputation traveled with him. In every gathering, there was space between him and the rest. Not out of fear, but because few knew how to engage a man who preferred quiet over attention. He was not the loudest voice. He was not the first to raise a mug or a song. He stayed at the edge of conversations, listening. The crew watched, followed. They knew his posture meant more than his words. The men aboard other ships sometimes wondered what drove him. He did not boast. He did not drink openly. He did not seek control. He appeared, observed, and vanished again. In time, stories filled the gaps. That he carried gold somewhere below deck. That he had buried it on a nameless island. That his silence hid knowledge passed down from older, darker waters. No one could say how much was true. He never answered questions directly. When asked about raids or maps, he changed the subject. When pressed, he walked away. It was not rudeness, it was habit. The fewer people who knew his plans, the more freely he could move. In quiet harbors, after nightfall, there were moments when pirate crews would gather around low fires on the beach, the ships rocking just beyond the tide. Voices low, rum passed slowly, the flicker of light catching old scars and worn cloth. In these spaces, Blackbeard might be seen at the edge of the firelight, not as a legend, not as a threat, but as a man who had drifted longer than most. He never stayed long, just enough to hear the stories, just enough to be remembered. And when he left, the silence seemed fuller. Beyond the marked coastlines, where maps curled into empty parchment and names gave way to sketches, there were islands that carried no flag. They rose low from the sea, thick with green, surrounded by reefs too shallow for larger ships. Some were little more than sandbars. Others held trees twisted by wind, paths worn by barefoot men, and waters that glowed faintly in the moonlight. These were the places pirates used not as homes, but as pauses, short spaces of stillness between long stretches of motion. Blackbeard had favored several. He never said their names if they had them. He called them by what they gave: a place to patch sails, to boil water, to dry powder. His men knew the signs: birds circling a certain way, the smell of mangrove long before the land appeared. The ship would slow, anchors dropped with care, fires lit low, and for a day, sometimes two, the Queen Anne's Revenge would disappear from sight, tucked behind shadowed coves and tall palms. There were others who used the same places. Sometimes signs were left, a mark in driftwood, a rope tied 3 times around a post, a circle of stones near the tree line. Warnings, invitations, or traces of passage. These islands were not claimed, but respected. Their quiet was valuable, their secrecy shared. At night the jungle grew louder than the deck. Insects hummed in rhythms that did not care for men. Small creatures passed between the trees unseen. The crew stayed close to the shore, rarely venturing inland. The land had rules of its own. The sea could be read. The land had no such kindness. Blackbeard often remained aboard during these stops. From the quarterdeck, he watched the shoreline, unmoving. His eyes followed his men, counted those who returned. He did not sleep deeply on these nights, not out of fear, but from knowing the stillness could change without sound. There were stories of islands that swallowed ships, places where compasses spun and men walked in circles until they vanished. Tales of drums heard beneath the waves, of lights deep in the jungle long after the fire was out. The crew did not speak of these aloud, but the silence after dusk told enough. No one lingered longer than they needed. Some claimed Blackbeard had a place of his own, an island no other ship could reach, a cave that opened only at low tide, a lagoon where his treasure lay beneath stone. He never mentioned it. He let the idea exist because it served him. A man with a secret is harder to follow. But if such a place existed, it was never marked. He left no symbols, no maps, only memory, scattered among men who sailed with him once and now had only distance to measure the past. When the Queen Anne's Revenge pulled anchor, no trace remained but a smooth patch of sand and the faint scent of ash. The island returned to quiet. The tide erased footprints, the wind pulled threads of smoke into the trees, and the sea, as always, opened ahead. For those who passed these places later, there was often a feeling, a weight in the air, a sense of having arrived just after something important had ended. They would pause, listen, walk a few steps into the trees, then leave. Not because of danger, but because whatever had happened there no longer needed to be seen. As years passed, some of the ships that once cut quickly through the wind began to slow. Their sails frayed more easily, their hulls creaked louder in the tide. The men aboard moved a little less swiftly, spoke a little less often. Some had spent most of their lives afloat. They had learned the habits of waves more deeply than they ever knew the streets of any town. And though the sea had shaped them, it had also worn them thin. Among pirates, there was no retirement. There were only choices: to keep moving, to vanish quietly, or to risk capture in waters that no longer tolerated their presence. The lucky ones found a quiet cove, took a new name, and vanished into the drift of old fishermen and forgotten shopkeepers. Others simply kept sailing, as long as wood and wind allowed. Blackbeard was never seen among the former. If he slowed, no one reported it. If his ship aged, it did so beneath fresh sails, beneath patched timbers and silent decks. Those who glimpsed the Queen Anne's Revenge later in its life noted how little had changed. The smoke still curled from ropes, the figure on the deck still stood motionless, the flag still hung dark and quiet. But change had come, even if it was not spoken. The crew was smaller now, fewer hands moved along the rail, the rhythm of work remained the same, but the noise had faded. There were no shouts, no singing. The ship spoke in creaks and canvas, in the slow clink of tools and boots against the deck. He did not recruit new men, not openly. Those who joined did so through quiet gestures, a nod at a shoreline, a message passed by someone trusted. New voices were rare, and they learned quickly not to speak unless needed. The culture aboard had become one of silence. It suited the captain. He no longer came to shore during stops. Supplies were handled by others. He remained on board, eyes scanning the trees or the horizon, unmoving even as crates were carried up and down the gangplank. When asked about this, no one answered. It was simply how things were. On longer stretches at sea, he walked the same narrow path along the deck. Not every day, but often enough that the wood beneath his boots was smoother than anywhere else. He would stop at the same points, near the mast, beneath the rigging, beside the rail where the stars were clearest at night. He touched nothing. He carried no weapon. He simply moved, a part of the ship's memory. The men did not speak to him unless he spoke first. And when he did, it was as it had always been. Few words, clear meaning, nothing left to echo. They didn't wonder where he would take them next. The idea of destination had faded. What mattered was that the ship still moved, still held against the current. At night, the sea seemed quieter. The stars hung lower. The sails whispered more than they snapped. And the man at the center of it all stood without motion, as though he had already begun to dissolve into the rhythm he had followed all his life. He was not feared now, not truly. He was simply known. And that, in the end, was the deepest kind of presence the sea could give. Not every pirate ship ended in fire. Some simply vanished. A sail last seen far out to sea, a hull that never returned to port. No wreck, no survivors, no trace of struggle. The ocean allowed these disappearances without resistance. It took things slowly, without drama, and without promise of return. There were names spoken once in every harbor, captains known for speed, for cruelty, for cleverness. But after a while, the names faded. Even their ships, once feared or respected, became ghost stories. Sailors spoke of them only when the wind died and the lanterns burned low. Blackbeard had seen it happen. He had met men who later vanished, shared drinks with those whose flags would never be seen again. He didn't speak of them, but he carried their absence in his choices. He knew which waters were unkind. He understood how quickly a known name could become a whisper. Some ships were said to have sunk in storms. Others struck reefs no chart had shown. A few may have been taken by disease, the entire crew lost before any sail could be lowered. And some perhaps simply stopped moving, their captains no longer able to command, their hulls too worn to float. But every once in a while, a sailor would return from a long voyage and claim to have seen one of them. A mast barely visible in morning fog, a black sail far out at sunset, the shape of a hull passing in silence beneath the stars. Nothing followed, nothing attacked, only a presence felt just long enough to make one wonder. Blackbeard himself had become that sort of presence. He had not fought in years, he had not raided in open daylight, but ships still changed course when they thought they saw his flag. Port still kept one eye on the water, listening for news. No one could confirm where he was, but no one could say he was gone. That uncertainty was part of the sea's memory. It did not require details, only impressions. A ship once seen, a voice once heard, a wake that passed too close on a windless day. Among his own crew, the sense of drift became more familiar. They no longer expected action. They performed their duties, kept watch, maintained the ship's path. But they no longer spoke of destinations. They followed motion for motion's sake. The Queen Anne's Revenge had become less a vessel than a pattern, something that continued because it always had. The ocean, for its part, gave no sign of judgment. It accepted the ship as it accepted waves. It did not hurry them. It did not stop them. It simply moved alongside, indifferent to purpose. And so the ship sailed, not fast, not loud, just steady. In time, the logs stopped being written. The routes were no longer marked. There were no messages sent ahead. Those who saw the ship began to wonder if it had always been there, or if they had imagined it. Blackbeard was seen less and less on deck. Some said he remained below. Others claimed he had taken to sleeping standing, like an old tree rooted in the hull. The truth, as always, stayed just beyond what anyone could confirm. But the ship was still there. On nights when the water held no reflection, when the air was still and heavy, something would drift through, large, quiet, dark, and be gone before anyone could raise a glass or speak a name. Not all disappearances are endings. Some are only returns. The sea holds no trails, no footprints, no paths, no markers to follow. And yet certain routes feel worn, as if others have passed that way again and again. A shift in the current, a change in light, the faint echo of wood where no ship can be seen. Signs not written, but remembered. Some sailors learn to feel them, not through maps, but through instinct. They know when they are not the first to cross a certain strait, or when the wind carries something older than weather. These impressions don't speak in words, but in presence, a feeling that this water has held more than waves. Blackbeard became one of those impressions, not just a man who sailed, but a path that others followed without knowing why. New captains mimicked his silence. Young crews kept discipline without being told. Ships passed through the same narrow cuts in the reef because someone once had, even if they no longer remembered who. He had never meant to become a model. He avoided titles. He dismissed ceremonies. But the way he moved, the choices he made, remained behind him like a faint wake stretching across years. And for those who watched closely, the signs were there. It was in the way the crew maintained the deck, quietly, methodically. In the way sails were lowered slowly at dusk, as if sound might disturb something in the air. In the way no music was played while drifting through fog, as if the fog itself were listening. He did not pass these habits down by rule. They emerged naturally, like the shape of the ship's motion, like the curve of the hull after years of wear. Even those who had never seen his face, who had only heard fragments of his story, still sensed something of him when the sea fell still. Among sailors, it became common to refer to certain choices as the old way, avoiding open fire, never anchoring in clear view, speaking only when necessary, letting the wind decide. These weren't laws, they were echoes. Some claimed they had passed a place where he once dropped anchor. They pointed to trees grown in a strange line or stones laid flat in a bay. No one was sure what they meant, but the act of noticing made the place feel different, more watched, more complete. On some nights, those aboard quiet ships would pause in their duties without knowing why. A lantern dimmed, a voice fell silent. A deckhand looked over his shoulder toward empty sea. No danger followed, no ship appeared, only the feeling that something unseen had passed near, that the moment had folded inward slightly, like a page creased without being turned. Blackbeard had become that kind of presence, a part of the ocean's memory, not tied to a single place or act, but to the rhythm of life without boundary. He had not left behind journals, he had drawn no maps, and yet his trail remained, not visible but felt. A suggestion of form in the fog, a line across the water where nothing floated, but something had clearly gone through. The sea, after all, is not just salt and depth, it is repetition, pattern. The same tide rising, the same wind falling. Within that repetition, the traces remain, of voices long silent, of sails long torn, of men who chose a path without destination. Time on land moves forward. It marks, it divides, it counts. But at sea, time circles. The same tides return, the same stars rise. A storm from last year can feel closer than yesterday's wind. And those who vanish are never entirely gone. They move with the current, return in silence, drift in forms that can't be measured. Blackbeard became one of those forms. He no longer belonged to a year or a battle or a name on a scroll. His presence remained in the rhythm of the waves, not spoken, not sung, only suggested by stillness. Fishermen in quiet villages spoke sometimes of a shadow that passed beneath the surface, too large for fish, too slow for a whale. They did not chase it, they did not ask questions. They only watched as the water calmed in its wake. In forgotten coves where few ships dared anchor, some claimed to hear footsteps on the beach where no one walked. A chain dragged briefly, a rope shifted. No voices followed. The sounds were never loud, never frantic, only familiar. And in deeper waters, where the stars reflect clean against black waves, there were nights when a second shape appeared beside a ship. No sails, no sound, only a long, low form moving just fast enough to remain beside you, just far enough not to be seen clearly. These weren't warnings. They didn't bring fear. If anything, they brought quiet, as if the sea were remembering itself. Sailors who felt it did not speak loudly. They spoke once, maybe twice, then let the moment drift away. The sea, they knew, did not like to be asked for stories. It offered only traces. The ones who had sailed under Blackbeard, even in his final years, rarely spoke of him at all. Not out of secrecy, but because they understood that speaking changed things. The memory was more honest when left undisturbed. He had taught them that by example, by his movement, his restraint, his refusal to let others define what could not be held. He did not correct rumors. He did not confirm truths. He let the sea speak on his behalf in ways no voice could match. Among younger sailors, his name still surfaced. They used it loosely to explain a strange current, to give shape to a feeling. Most had never seen him, never met anyone who had. But still the name returned. Like a tide, it rose without warning and slipped back just as quickly. Ships painted small symbols on the inside of their hulls. A dark line, a faded circle, a mark scratched low by the waterline. Not in worship, not in fear, but as a kind of recognition that something once passed this way, that something still might. The sea itself seemed to favor no story. It did not preserve wrecks. It did not guard treasures. But it did hold motion. It did carry patterns. And so when a ship paused mid-journey, when the wind fell quiet and the water lay still for longer than it should, some would say, he's near. Not as a ghost, not as a man, but as the reason why stillness feels different, why silence sometimes has shape. Blackbeard had never asked for memory. He had never chased legacy. But in surrendering to the sea completely, in trusting its silence more than any port, he had become part of it. Not a name now, not a story, a current. There comes a point when the line between ship and water softens, when the hull no longer resists the tide but leans into it, when sails no longer fight the wind but follow its breath like leaves drifting on a slow river. Some ships reach this point after decades. Others never do. But those that do are remembered without being seen. The Queen Anne's Revenge was last seen clearly by no one. Reports blurred, descriptions changed. A black sail here, a dark figure there, a flag that flickered and vanished. But the details no longer mattered. The ship had passed into something else, a presence, not a vessel. It still moved. It still cut across the water in quiet, steady arcs. But it no longer entered harbors. It did not anchor. It did not trade. It drifted. Always distant, always just beyond the reach of a spyglass. And when it passed, the sea behind it lay smoother, as though calmed by its presence. Blackbeard had stopped giving commands long before. The crew, what remained of it, understood the course. They adjusted sails without being told. They kept watch without shift. Meals were shared quietly, the rituals held. But no one called him captain anymore. They didn't need to. He sat near the stern most days, eyes forward, hands still, not watching, not waiting, just present. The men spoke of him less often, not from fear, but from familiarity. He was no longer separate from the ship. He had become part of its structure, like the mast, like the creaking boards beneath bare feet. At night, the stars above the ship burned brighter. The sky seemed lower, the wind gentler. The ocean beneath, darker but more accepting. They no longer sailed to reach anything. They sailed because motion itself had become their purpose. Sometimes other ships passed at a distance, merchant sloops, navy patrols, even other pirates. But they never came close. Some saw a shape, others saw nothing, only felt the change, the sudden hush, the pull in the tide, the sensation of being watched without fear. None gave chase. There was no reason. What could be pursued was no longer real in the way it once had been. There were rumors that Blackbeard had died quietly on deck, that he had slipped into the water during a calm night, leaving no sound, that he had walked into the hold one final time and never returned. The crew gave no confirmation. They simply continued, as if his presence required no body. Some said the ship no longer carried any crew at all, that it moved on its own, guided by winds no one else could feel, that its sails stayed full even on still waters, that its lanterns glowed without flame. And perhaps by then none of it mattered. The ship was no longer a name or a flag or a place for men. It had become part of the ocean's logic, something that belonged not to history but to the repeating rhythms of tide and shadow. To see it was not to witness. It was to understand that some things leave not marks, but conditions. That a ship can become silence, that a man can become direction. And when the Queen Anne's Revenge passed once more across a glassy sea, there were no cries, no signals, no attempts to follow. Only stillness, then wind, then open water. No chart shows where it ends. The lines on the page stop. The names fade. But the sea continues, wider and quieter, past the places men measure. There is water still, there is wind, but the echoes of story fall away. What remains is only motion, soft and endless. That is where he went. Blackbeard did not seek destination, he did not fear conclusion. His path was not one of conquest or retreat. It was drift, chosen, deliberate, peaceful. A slow continuation into the part of the world where no one follows. Not because they can't, but because they no longer need to. Those who remember him speak not of what he did, but of how he moved. Without rush, without need for approval. He was not a man of beginnings or endings. He was a line across water drawn not in ink, but in patience. The Queen Anne's Revenge is not gone. It is unseen. It has become the suggestion of shape in the fog, the sound of wood when there is no ship, the feeling that something has passed, just now, but left no wake. It sails where no port waits, beneath stars uncounted, beyond winds that bear no names, and there Blackbeard remains, not as legend, not as captain, but as rhythm, as breath, as the silence between waves. There is nothing more to chase, nothing more to prove. The sea has accepted him, not as a visitor, but as its own. And in return, it carries his memory not in words, but in stillness. Ships will come and go, flags will rise and fall, but some things do not end. They simply pass beyond the part of the world that needs names. So if one night you find yourself at sea, in thought or in dream, and the wind grows quiet and the water darkens beneath your feet, listen. If you hear nothing, if you feel only calm, then perhaps you are near. Perhaps something old and steady is passing close, not to disturb, only to remind. That freedom is not a place, that legend is not a man, that rest is not silence, it is being carried. And now, dear listener, as the tide of this tale slows, let it take you too. Let your thoughts become ships, your breath become current, your body become still. Close your eyes if they haven't already. Let the ocean move beneath you. Let the wind hold your weight. Let the night wrap around you like a sail folded for the last time. You've journeyed long enough for now. There are no more directions to follow. Only waves. Only rest. Thank you for sailing with me, and may the sea carry you gently into your dreams. Good night.